honor, a real honor to be delivering this keynote here today, and I cannot thank you enough for the invitation. It's wonderful to see the participants and names popping up on the screen in front of me, and to really have this level of engagement is simply terrific. Now, you may not be able to see it, but I'm wearing a unicorn badge on my lapel. And why am I wearing a unicorn badge today, you may ask? Well, the answer is that this is in relation to a conversation that I had really not that long ago. I think it was less than a year ago, with a senior in-house lawyer, and she regaled me with the story of her meeting with a law firm the previous week. And the law firm had been trying to get the company's business for arbitration, and they'd done a whole beauty parade of their arbitration experience. And my friend and colleague, the in-house lawyer, looked at the three white men who were presenting to her and said, well, what about diversity in arbitration? And this slightly blindsided the lawyers that were there, but the partner eventually sort of responded, well, he said, the problem is that good female arbitrators don't exist. They're like unicorns. And so what did I do when I heard this story? I went out and ordered 200 of these unicorn badges. And I send them out to any woman who sits as an arbitrator, and I extend that invitation to all of you who are listening, and obviously my co-panelists. Mail me your address if you've sat as an arbitrator. I will send you one of these coveted unicorn badges. Now, in fact, that lawyer was quite wrong. He was mistaken when he said that good female arbitrators are like unicorns. There is a wealth of experience at the top end of our profession. It is simply no longer true to imply that we are a minority in that sense. But what we must do is we must nurture the talent that is here, and we must develop and nurture the talent, the wave of talents that we see coming through, the highly impressive wave of junior practitioners coming through our industry. That is what we really have to focus on. So what I want to do today, in just the 10 or 15 minutes that you very kindly indulging me with, I want to look firstly at the statistics that's available. And to do that, I will take a minute and just share my screen with you so you can see some data on this. I always think it's helpful to put things into context a little bit. So allow me to do that, if I may. And that should be up on the screen in front of you. Now, I first began collating data on the appointment of women as arbitrators, and I would say that we have to recognize that this no way tells the whole story. This tells the story of the top end of the profession. It does not give us the complete picture, but it is a start. And when I started looking at this back in 2011, there was really very, very little data available. So we have built significantly on that since then. Now, as I say, I began looking at this in 2011, and what you see on the slide in front of you is kind of the historic data that I was able to extrapolate at that time. And you can see that certainly when I started out back in 1996, we really were unicorns, but that has really changed since, and it has been extremely satisfying to see that uptick. And the reason you see the uptick in the 2015, 2016 is, as we all know, I say, the influence of the Equal Representation and Arbitration Pledge. So this is a brief snapshot of where we were, as I say, when I really started digging into this back in 2011. And you can see the stats are not great. The ICC's okay with just over 10%. The others are pretty unimpressive, frankly. Here you can see the progress since the pledge. And I'm getting to the stage now where I can say with a bit more confidence that the progress is not simply just due to better reporting of the data. I think there is actually a sea change that is happening. And I say that because not only have we had the increase year on year, I'm crunching at the moment the 2019 figures. They're looking even better than the 2018 figures. And so it is true that we have better reporting, but as I say, I think there is a significant improvement as well. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to come back to that. Now, I want to touch on the barriers to appointing diverse candidates as international arbitrators, and particularly to consider what they are. As I say, when I looked at this in detail back in 2011, I concluded that the factors that impacted women being promoted within the arbitration world were pipeline leak, leaving the profession essentially, implicit bias against appointing a woman as an arbitrator, and lack of visibility. Now, my thinking has evolved a little bit more recently, and to that list, I would also now add the way that society really sees men, and particularly the Western society sees white men, as the sort of human default, if I can call it that. Now, it's pervasive across society as a whole, but I think there is an assumption, and we all have to question it, that an arbitrator is, quote, male unless otherwise indicated, if that makes sense. And that assumption is kind of endemic, and it's an assumption we all make. And I have lost count of the times that I sit in the audience at conferences and I hear male and female speakers use he to refer to an arbitrator, and they do it without thinking. And I'm sure I've done it. I don't now because I'm very attuned and very sensitized to it. But we use this default he pronoun, I would say, almost across the board. And although we know the pushback, which is, well, it's generic when you use he, we mean both sexes. Using he as a generic doesn't get read that way. And I'm going to quote you a piece of writing, a quote from Invisible Women, which is a book I have been devouring in the last couple of weeks. And I really, really commend it to anyone in the audience who's very interested in a data-based analysis of the lack of women's issues generally. So Caroline Criado Perez, who's the author, says, when the generic masculine is used, people are more likely to recall famous men than famous women, to estimate a profession as male-dominated, to suggest male candidates for jobs and political appointments. Women are less likely to apply and less likely to perform well in interviews. They're less likely to apply for jobs that are advertised using the generic masculine. In fact, she says, the generic masculine is read as so overwhelmingly male that it even overrides otherwise powerful stereotypes, so that professions such as beautician, which are usually stereotyped female, are suddenly seen as male. And I thought that was really, really quite staggering. And I had never thought about it in that way before. And so I am a little bit concerned that we are starting to talk about arbitrators and female arbitrators. And that's a plea I really want to make to everyone on the call today, which is let's try and move away from that. Let's not call somebody a female arbitrator. I'm just an arbitrator. And I say this not to be difficult or provocative, but because I really want to avoid underscoring the notion that a female arbitrator is somehow different from the default male arbitrator. And I struggle with this because it is exacerbated where there is a suggestion that there's somehow a risk in choosing somebody that's not the default arbitrator. And I would say, again, in the Western international arbitration sphere, that default is usually a white male and usually of a certain age. And as I go back to my initial point, there is a raft of highly experienced female arbitrators, and we are not unicorns. And a second plea for you all today is that a few years ago, and you may or may not have heard this, I used to hear it all the time, no one ever got fired for choosing IBM. And that really meant you're not going to get in trouble as an in-house lawyer or as an external counsel if you choose the default. And again, we're back to what that default represents. And we just have to stop going down that route. We have to stop insinuating that non-typical arbitrators, whether they're not typical because they're women or whether they're from a certain geographic region or a certain ethnicity, we have to stop insinuating that they are not IBM in that sense. They are not safe pair of hands. They are not experienced, because it is simply not true. Now, one thing that is unarguable, I'm afraid, is that although women arbitrators may be numerous, we are much less visible than male arbitrators. And I'm going to share my screen again, because I want you to look at some data that I've put together very recently on visibility, and in particular on female speaker participation at conferences. Across the board, the data shows that arbitration institutions appoint more women than other means of appointment. So you're much more likely to be appointed as a woman if you have an institutional appointment than if you're appointed by the parties or the co-arbitrators. And one of the reasons I think that institutions can do that is because they have access to information about arbitrators, more access than most. And so what you have to do as an arbitrator is work very, very hard to increase your visibility. And one of the real ways to do this is to write papers and speak at conferences. So last year I went through, and it was a fairly tortuous process, I went through and I analysed, with the great help, I will say, of a wonderful trainee at Freshfields, I analysed 231 international arbitration conferences, and it seems extraordinary that we managed to hold 231 conferences, you know, on this in this industry in that period, but we did. And there were over 71 geographic locations, so we were very, very broad data set, and I would say, you know, pretty solid data set there. And unsurprisingly, you see the results on the slides there, that across the board, and I took a very broad approach to what I considered a speaker. It was really anyone who spoke at the podium. But you can see there the breakdown, and you are overwhelmingly much more likely to speak, you're twice as likely to speak at a conference if you're a man than a woman. So we are conducting the same research this year. It's going to be very, very different. I am excited to see the differences, because obviously we couldn't be in a more different world now than the one we were in last year. I really want to look at whether webinars increase female participation or have an adverse effect on it. What we know from the pandemic is that it has a disproportionate effect on women. That is clear across the board. And it will be very interesting. It's too early to tell right now, but it will be very interesting when we get to the end of this year to compare our data. One thing that was positive, what I did, this was the global, all the conferences we looked at. And then what I did was extract conferences that had a particular focus. And that's the subject of the next screen, sorry, the next slide on your screen. And that is more encouraging. That shows that what I've done here is, if you look at all the conferences are in blue, but if you look at the grey bars, you can see that I've pulled out those conferences that focused on either diversity events, either diversity theme, or they were young events, so hosted by under 45 groups, of which there are many, many groups across the world. And I think obviously the diversity events are going to be unsurprising, but what was very encouraging was the young events, and how they have a far, far more balanced roster of speakers. So that probably reflects the practitioners who are coming through, which I think they are coming through in greater numbers. That is for sure, but also reflects an awareness of these issues that perhaps doesn't arise in relation to the traditional standard conferences. So that I leave you with that. It's a bit more encouraging, but certainly watch this space in terms of how we are, where we get to in relation to the 2020 conferences. So I will stop my screen sharing. And what I really want us to remember today is three key things, and they're what everyone talks about when we discuss these issues: diversity, equality, and inclusion. And too often I think we only call it diversity. You have to think about that triumvirate. And I want to pause on diversity first. And when I talk about diversity, I'm probably going to talk about a different aspect of it than you expect. One thing I've been thinking about a great deal recently is how I, in particular, don't get the opportunity to see diversity in women. because there are simply such small numbers of women at most meetings that I go to, the hearings that I have as arbitrator, and the conferences that I attend. And you know, I have practiced in this field for over 20 years, and really it was only last year when I had the great honor of delivering the keynote at an International Women's Day event that I actually saw true diversity amongst the women that was attending. The room was full, and I looked in the audience, and there were some very honorable men there, including Latif, who was in the audience. But when I looked there and I saw this sea of women in front of me, and it was a really, really meaningful experience, and it really brought home to me how there is great diversity in us. And when we operate in such small numbers, which we all do in this male-dominated profession that we're in, we really lose that the value of being diverse within our minority group. And when you don't have strength in numbers, that I think you get much more gender conforming behavior. We get lumped together as female arbitrators, where of course, you know, we are individuals, we're arbitrators, we're counsel, we're practitioners, and we don't need a qualifier in front of our title. So once there are more of us, and there will be more of us, I think we'll be able to sort of escape the need to conform to a stereotype. And that when there is a critical mass of female arbitrators in particular, there won't be a need to qualify us based on our sex. So let me turn to equality of the three. Now, our profession is extremely academically rigorous, and rightly so. But we have to understand that this bites hard on a certain group of aspiring arbitration practitioners, because there is simply not equality of opportunity in terms of access to networking, education, career options. And this is where initiatives like Mandy's Careers in Arbitration is just so well timed, so needed, and so important. And I've said for years that we have to stop allowing and encouraging unpaid internships. We have to have better outreach at the student level. And here, the Chartered Institute has done really well with its thousands of student members that it has now, and its free student membership. And for those of you who aren't members who might be on the call and qualify for free student membership, I really encourage you to join the Institute on that basis. And I also would commend mentoring schemes like Arbitral Women's Mentoring Scheme, which has run for years now. And I've participated in this scheme as a mentor for a number of years. I have some wonderful mentees, and it's a really enriching process, I think, for both the mentees and the mentors. So I do think that is an area that I think have neglected. And as I say, I am concerned about the disproportionate effect on women that the pandemic is going to have. And we all need to be very cognizant of that and really do our best to support our female colleagues through this time and thereafter, so that we can bring those junior practitioners through, and we don't get the pipeline leak that we've really suffered from for many, many years in this field. And the third point I mentioned was inclusion. And again, this is not something that is particularly talked about. And if you look at inclusion, it can take really two forms. One, facilitating access to a group. And then the second way of including is to integrate the new members into the group. Now, I've been on my own as an arbitrator now for 3 years. I was astonished by how welcoming the community was to me as a new arbitrator practicing on my own. So I think we are very good at welcoming new members once they're in. What we are not good at as a community is facilitating the access initially. And that's where we have to work. And when you talk about inclusion, there's a great quote. It's somebody made this: diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And I always translate this to arbitration appointments, say diversity is being added to list, but inclusion is being appointed. And there's a real difference there. So when we discuss these things, we shouldn't just be saying we need diversity. It's far, far more complex than that. We need to think more broadly, and we need to consider those triumvirate of issues that I've mentioned. Diversity within the minority group, equality of opportunity, and inclusion, better access to the group. But I'm going to suggest another triumvirate to conclude with for you, and I'm going to call them the 3 T's. And I would say that these 3 T's are: we must keep talking, we have to be mindful of our language, we have to listen as well as talk, we have to keep taking 5 minutes. Take 5 minutes to think before you act. Have I considered all the aspects that I really need to think about before I appoint this arbitrator, before I select this counsel? Have I been balanced in my approach? Keep trying, because if we don't try, then who is going to try? But above all,